Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Let me introduce our panelists today. We're going to talk about working with and understanding the research community. I know there's a great deal of interest in home education research. It's something we're always talking about in our advisory board meetings. And so I've invited some of our established scholars who are with us at the conference to share their perspective and their goals as researchers, and to invite your questions and your comments. And ideally we'll be able to have a good, robust discussion. So Philippe Bongrand is here from CYU, because I cannot say the name of his university outside of Paris. And Guterman and Neuman are here from Western Galilee University in Israel. And Dr. Harriet Pattison from Liverpool Hope University here in the UK, and Dr. Angela Watson from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So welcome, and thank you so much for your time and your engagement with us. I wanted to start by just letting you introduce yourselves to the group. Angela, we'll start with you, and we want to know why you are interested, or how you came to become interested in the home education population, and what research questions you're trying to answer.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I've been really interested to hear from so many of you already and learn from you what's going on in the international context. I work primarily and only really in U.S. homeschool context and landscape. So that's where most of my experience lies. So I started back to school as a non-traditional student in my late 30s. I had dropped out of college after about my first year, got a job, got married, had kids, and when I had children, I got involved in some childbirth advocacy work there and had some success, and decided that, I wanted to impact education. And so I naively thought that I could, fix the education problems in the United States. And so I went back to school. I got my bachelor's and my master's both in education. I was a certified teacher. I knew I wanted to work in education policy though, so I went straight into a PhD in education policy. And it was during that time that, of course, I had my own children. We were trying to figure out what to do for their educations. Because of my PhD, we ultimately decided to send them to a mix of private when they were little and then public school. So my own children have gone all the way through public school. But I was always really curious about homeschooling. I was also working in education policy with a focus on education reform. There were very few people in our program and in the US really that were looking rigorously at homeschool research. And so I thought it was an interesting topic. I had friends that homeschooled, and it was something that I thought, I would pick up. And so I started doing some homeschool research at that time. I continued that on once I joined Hopkins. We do lots of research on lots of things. So I study teacher prep and curriculum implementation and various, all the things. But I kind of kept homeschooling as my pet project that I would do for my own research. And then COVID happened, and suddenly I got really popular. Pandemic pods were happening in the US. They needed somebody to do some research on the pods, and so I got tapped for that. That paper and the subsequent publications that came out of that got a lot of attention, and the homeschooling work really took off. I started getting some funding interest, which, in my position, we can't research things that aren't funded. And so once the funding came in, now I'm able to dedicate 90% of my time to homeschool, and I call them homeschool adjacent models, hybrid schools, micro schools, those types of things that kind of fall under the homeschool umbrella. So I spend most of my time now working on that. We are really looking at it from my work at the kind of the ground floor level. People always want to know about test scores, or do the kids really perform better in homeschooling? Like, look, guys, we don't even know who, we don't know how many, we don't know where they are, right? And so we're really trying to look at some of these really basic level things. Also during the pandemic and post-pandemic, there were a lot of news stories about homeschooling, and some of the portrayal of homeschoolers and just some of the misconceptions that kept being repeated really aggravated me, because I knew as a researcher that a lot of that stuff wasn't true. So really kind of shining a light on some of these misconceptions. So I feel like we do a lot of kind of what I consider myth busting, but really looking at the facts. So for example, in the United States, the common rhetoric is, oh yeah, you know, homeschoolers are mostly white. And so people kind of discount homeschooling. They try to like other homeschooling because it's majority white. Well, indeed, it is majority white, but that's because also the majority of Americans are white. And so when you really look at the participation in homeschooling, it's about 60% of the American population identifies as white, and about 64% of homeschoolers in America are white. So really, the representation of homeschoolers as when they say, oh, mostly white, you could hear that as 99% of homeschoolers are white. But the truth of the matter is that they're very, very much reflective of our population demographics. And so we kind of shine a light on some of those things to kind of help people better understand what we're really talking about when we talk about homeschooling in the US context.
I'm Harriet Pattison, and I've been researching home education for around about 20 years now. And it started off with our own children who, for sort of a combination of reasons, didn't begin school. And we were kind of a bit sort of messy, unschooly kind of, but that doesn't kind of sort of quite fit with really young children. It was just family life, you know. And then our elder daughter learned to read, and I had no idea how she'd done it. And it was a real sort of, I don't know, I always say knock me down with a feather because you really could at that stage. I was just like, what the heck happened there? You know, how come this child can read? Because I haven't taught her and nobody else has, and I just don't know how she can do it. And I got really hooked on that. I got really hooked on trying to find an answer to that question. And that's what got me into the academic study of. And I suppose it's funny, really, because my initial impetus for home education research was pedagogy. And how does learning happen, and what was happening in situations like our daughter learning to read by herself like that. But the more I did of it, the more involved I got in it, the more it became political. So I've ended up doing things like the Christian home educators, you know, from a policy political point of view rather than a pedagogical point of view. And it just seems to keep coming.
Thank you. I'm Ari Neuman, and I thought about it, what would be better to say, whether it is that I've been researching homeschooling for 25 years, more or less, a little bit less, or a quarter of a century, which sounds much better, a quarter of a century. But really, 25 years ago, I was into a different subject altogether. I was always interested in biology and also in education, especially alternative education. And I had my bachelor's degree and also my master's degree in biology. And then I was introduced to the book by Roland Mahan about homeschoolers as trailblazers. And I read it, and immediately I became in love with the subject. It was so intriguing for me that since that time until today, and hopefully many more years, I'm researching homeschooling and all kinds of aspects of homeschooling. And I think as a researcher, I was blessed to research an area or a subject that was not extensively researched before, especially not in Israel, but I think around the world there is more and more research, academic research on homeschooling, but when I started, there was very little about it, very little known about homeschooling in Israel, which for an academic researcher is a gold mine. Because you can research whatever you want to and whatever is interesting for you, and every time that you research something, it is new, and it is like contributing to the knowledge that was not yet there. So for 25 years, I've been looking at homeschooling with my colleague, which will present himself soon, Oz. And we've been looking at different kinds of aspects of homeschooling. And I want to say that I'm a mainly qualitative researcher. So I'm interested in the experience, in the way people perceive the reality and the life. And I find fascinating points of view and very interesting ideas when looking into homeschooling. I think there is a win-win situation between academics and homeschooling, providing there are certain terms, but I think this is something, Deborah, that we will get into later, right? Yeah. So, and thank you for having me here.
Hello, everybody. My name is Oz, like the wizard of Oz. Debra asks us, why do we study homeschooling? And I'll say because it's fascinating. Fascinating. It's so obvious that kids go to school. Whenever you see like a kid's book or everything, you see a kid, you see him, with going to school, going back to school, talking about school or being on the weekend. And what do school do to our children? Okay, so it doesn't matter if you go to public school, some kind of an alternative school, but it's still school. And what does it mean? What does it mean to the emotional world of the child? What does it mean to his social skills? What does it mean to his happiness? So our studies are mainly comparative studies. We want to understand the difference between different kinds of homeschooling. What does it mean if a family, I don't know, have unschooling or schooling? What does it mean? What does it mean to the happiness of the child? And what does it mean if you go to school or if you're homeschooled? What does it mean to your creativity? This is the main questions that fascinates us. And we also, as Ari said, want to understand the story that people tell themselves. How do they see it? If you ask children at school and children that are homeschooled, what is success of education? What do you want to achieve? They answer you in a different way. They have a different internal story. So why do we study homeschooling? Well, because it's fascinating.
Hi, so I'm Philippe from Paris. So why did I research home education? It was for theoretical reasons. So I wrote a PhD in political science about school policies, and more exactly on schooling policies. So it was an inquiry about how public authorities fosters during from the 1940s until the 1990s in France, how public policies fostered school attendance. So it was a way to analyze how they tried to convince families that it was worth schooling children. So my idea, I wasn't aware of the existence of home education like many French people. Now it's becoming to change, but at the moment then it was totally unknown. And so it was a PhD about the way public authorities work and they design the population and the way people and families see the future, see their children's future, and to sum it up, is just work at school so you succeed in life. So my PhD was about how the public administrations try to foster parents to believe in that. So it was a PhD in public policies designed with some concept of the French philosopher Michel Foucault that you mentioned during the sessions. So these French philosophers talk about biopolitics. There is a way for public policies to design a group of people who are governed, even if they do not feel or understand that they are governed, because they are convinced that if they follow their own interests, they will thrive. But in fact, would say Foucault, it's just very raw. It's the way that administration and the states design their mind, so they are feeling that they follow their interests, but in fact they are statized, or it's a kind of étatisation in France. So, and so it's a way to analyze very common in French political science. And when you analyze this way, there is always a question that is raised when you defend your PhD, for instance, is the way, okay, that's great, you have the state that convince families to school their children, but what about resistance? Where are they? So it's a typical question that raised Michel Foucault analysis, and I was a student, so I said, okay, that's a good question. And I was looking for resistance toward this massive schooling policy. And then I found that there were some families not schooling their children, and that was really unknown at the moment. So it was, and then it was like, my colleague said that it was a kind of gold mine, because it was a discovery even to see that it was possible to home educate and so on. And we had absolutely nothing, just some books written by home educators, but they were not in big publishers, so it was very difficult to find. And so I wrote a postdoctoral project to get an academic position about home education, and I got a position, and it was the opportunity to research this. So it has been now 10 years that I'm researching that, because like Harriet said, every dimension is unknown. There is so much to learn that is great for a researcher who is paid just to produce new knowledge. So as compared with so many scholarships about schools and education at school, we are in our role when we research unknown topics. So it's great, it's very comfortable to research.
Thank you, very helpful. Before we move on and open it up to our audience, I'm going to ask one more question, and I'll start with you, Philippe. What barriers have you found to researching this population, and how have you, if so, creatively found a workaround?
Okay, so I coordinated a collective project whose main goal was just to produce demographics about home educators. And we wanted to have good statistics. And so the main barrier was to gain access to administrative data sets, because in France, every home educator has to register. So in many administrations, they have files and they know exactly who is home educated, whether there are boys or girls and so on. And so it took many years, really many years, to get access to this data that we eventually got access to, but it was the main barrier. But once we have done that, it was great because we had access, and so we are about to publish a book with the very new demographics about this. And there were, and the other barrier I will just mention, it was really it was a smaller barrier, but maybe it's worth mentioning it here. So we had to negotiate this access to the administrative data. We had to be trustworthy, and so the French state needed to be sure that we had nothing to do with home education advocates. So it was very difficult because from the beginning on, home educators were very friendly, very open. We could research, we could take part to conference and so on. It was great, but we had to appear neutral at least neutral with the administration, because it's so conflictual between home educators and the administration. And so the barrier was to explain to our home educating parents partners that we were, in fact, we were trying to be not part of the conflict, and we wanted to access this data set. So it was we needed these advocates not to mention our works too quickly, so that the administration doesn't think that we are supporting them. But of course, we were very happy when they read our publications and said that it proved that home educators are not dangerous Islamist separatists, of course. But we needed to be aside. It has nothing to do with the barrier we faced with the administration, but maybe it's important to mention that here.
Oh, you want us to answer the same question?
I thought you could go in order. Yes.
I'm just
Okay, great.
Down the line. And if anybody wants to comment on each other's comments, feel free to jump in. I don't want to be too formalized.
There are advantages and disadvantages to studying homeschooling in Israel. The advantage is that I think the population really understand the necessity for research on homeschooling, mainly because they want answers. What actions do they take, and how does these actions influence their children? So there's a thirst for knowledge. When we give talks or something, people are very interested. They want to understand. So it's easy to get people to cooperate and to be part of the study. There's no, you talked about like this suspicion in the US. We don't have it at all. As a matter of fact, parents says, okay, if there's a problem, we want to know about it. It's our interest to know if there's a problem. The downside of conducting research in Israel is budgets. We have our university budget, but usually recruiting budgets for a non-technological question is way harder. And usually we have, this is our main struggle, receiving the funds to conduct a large enough study so it will be in very high standards and will be able to actually conclude about the answers. What do you say, Harry? Do you agree?
Yes, of course.
Is funding a problem for all of you, or a challenge you have to figure out?
So would you like them to answer first, Debra? Yes?
Please go. Yes. Go ahead, Harriet.
I think the main obstacle that we have, or one of the main obstacles that we have in Israel, is not from the part of homeschooling, but from the part of the school-going children. Because we are trying to do comparative research in order to avoid the criticism that we are only researching homeschooling, so we only look at homeschooling, and many people are interested in comparing. So we are trying also to do comparative research. And right now we are doing a very large-scale research into family relations in homeschooling. And we have amazing cooperation from the homeschooling community. Amazing. We have conducted interviews that lasted 4 and 5 hours. We had to do it in 2 or 3 times, and they were very patient, and they were talking to us, and it was amazing. And on the other hand, it is very difficult for us to get interviewees from the school-going community. So this is one problem that we have, and the other one is that in Israel we have homeschooling supervisors. They are allowed to talk to the families and even in some cases visit them. And we wanted to introduce to these supervisors some of our research in order for them to be able to make decisions based on data and not on gut feeling or whatever. And we were unable to do it. We got their cooperation at the beginning, and then we couldn't do it anymore. So, and this is also one of the reasons that the homeschooling community is so cooperative, because I think they understand that once there is real data, then people will be able to act upon this data and not only upon gut feeling or policies or whatever, because if they have data, they can act upon it.
I think I've got two words, and it overlaps an awful lot with what you guys have said, and I think the two words are trust and ethics. And I think the trust thing kind of runs in two directions. First of all, the home education community, whoever they are, have to trust the researcher. And I've been quite fortunate in the sense that because I have been a home educator, that is an engender of trust, but it's not complete. So, for example, when I wanted to research Muslim home education, there were massive issues of trust with people basically not trusting me, not wanting to say things to anybody, or maybe not to me, certainly, that could put them in any kind of risk. So I think that's a really big thing. And I think, in turn, as a home education researcher, we are not trusted. And I think Brian was talking about this morning, Brian, and it's come up somewhere else as well, about being seen to be an advocate rather than a researcher, and somebody who's going to support home education because they've done it, or because they have friends who do it, or rather than somebody who is going to adhere to the ethics of being a researcher. And it's interesting that those questions in home education research, those questions kind of distill down onto the researcher rather than being questions of methodology, because as Brian pointed out this morning, all research has its limitations, and all good researchers would accept the limitations and would want to accept and see the limitations of what they do and what other people do. But very often the criticisms against home education research distill down to the actual researcher. So there's issues of trust. And there are also, I think, big issues of ethics and the principle of not doing harm, which is sometimes a really tricky one to navigate as a researcher in this area. So, for example, my research about learning to read, finding out that many home-educated children didn't learn to read until they were 10, 12, 13, some of them even older than that, is a really interesting thing to find out about reading. It's a really interesting thing to find out about education. It's incredibly informative and has a lot of potential behind it to change the ways that we think about reading pedagogy, or what it means to be literate, or how children learn to read, and so on. But also, in the wrong hands, it can become, look, these people are failing their children, because there are 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds who are unable to read. That is educational abuse. So if people choose to use it that way, that same research could be used against home education. And so, and I actually, I'm back in the same position with the Christian home education, because I have got data from Christian home educators now that which could be used against them, basically. Ideas that people have talked about that sound very strange and quite frankly wrong to lots of ears. And it's a question now about, what do I do with that data? Do I pretend I haven't got it? Because I think that there's high potential that it will harm the people who gave it to me, not as individuals, because it's all anonymous and confidential, but as a generalised argument about the things that people might believe or might think. So do I pretend it doesn't exist, or do I acknowledge it and find ways to explore it that I don't know, are framed in particular ways that I think might make it more acceptable or more understandable to people from the outside who, you know, to be fair to them, are coming to these questions cold themselves and don't have very much apart from their own common sense and their own backgrounds to start interrogating them. So I would say they are the difficulties. And then there's the funding.
So, I mean, I share a lot of those same issues. The data has been a problem in the U.S., getting access to data and reliable data. However, we recently have, because of COVID, the U.S. Census started putting out the Pulse survey, and it has really rich information in there about a nationally representative sample of Americans, but within that are homeschoolers. So we have enough information in there that could keep a team of a dozen researchers busy for years. So we have a lot of data coming from that, which is great. It doesn't mean that we don't wish we had more, but you know, we always want more. So you know, we're in a better position, I feel, you know, right now with data than we were 3 or 4 years ago. Funding has been interesting, you know. I particularly work on all soft funding, so everything I touch has to be funded or it has to come out of my personal time. And so that was a challenge with homeschool work, but I've gotten funding. The interest is increasing as the number of students increase, and so people are interested in that. But then the backside of that problem is that when you take that funding, then people are like, oh, but you're funded by X, and so you must align with whatever X's, you know, opinions are or whatever. So we, you know, I have to deal with some of that. So there are pros and cons that come with the funding as well. I've tried really hard to stay in the middle, which is kind of what Philippe was talking about. The problem with being in the middle, which I naively should have thought of, is that you get hit from the left and the right. so like I'm getting pummeled from both sides, right? The advocates are like, but you shouldn't be doing that. And the other side is like, but you should be doing more. And so that's a really interesting like position and line to try to walk as a researcher. And then, you know, just trying to, the trust, I think, in the relationships. Trying to build the trust, trying to build the relationships to have some at least cooperation or some open dialogue, you know, to be able to talk about differences. I am an outsider. I think that helps me bring a different perspective to the work and some credibility from critics. I don't subscribe to the idea that you can't be a good homeschool researcher and be a homeschooler. We would never say that you couldn't be a good public school researcher because you publicly schooled your children, right? Nobody would ever make that argument, yet they try to make the flip argument for homeschoolers. But I mean, I do think I have kind of a different perspective that I view as a strength. Others may not, but people do view me as an outsider. Particularly in the United States, we have a huge growth in Black and brown homeschooling. I have seen some difficulty entering into that realm. And so I have really tried to partner with researchers who work in those communities and are also of that community or those communities. And there are Black homeschool researchers who are Black and who also homeschool. I have yet to find any Hispanic homeschool researchers. So that's something that we're really trying to cultivate and bring along so that we can, you know, try to grow that research and grow researchers doing that work. I think that's important, you know, that work be coming out of people in those communities or you know, that understand that community. So, you know, all of that partnership and trust thing, I think those are all things that we're really trying to work on as well.
Thank you, really, really good points and observations. I'm opening it up now to the audience. What questions would you like to pose? And I'll bring the microphone to you so we can get this on the tape. Thank you.
Hello. So it's interesting actually that a number of you said that home educators were very fast to come forward. I've really struggled to recruit home educating parents to come to my focus groups and one-to-one interviews, whereas actually it was inundated with schooling parents. So it's just an interesting comparison. I wonder if you think that there's a role for researchers to play. A number of you talked about the importance of opening up dialogue, and I very specifically did 2 different focus groups, but I wonder whether you think that actually there's a role for the research to facilitate a mixed focus group, for example, of home educating and schooling parents to actually kind of start breaking down some of those barriers and building some of the bridges in understanding.
I mean, I would say, so I think a huge misconception about homeschoolers, at least from a U.S. perspective, right? I know very little about the international perspective, so I'm learning a lot. The misconception about homeschoolers in the U.S. is that homeschoolers always homeschool and always homeschool all of their kids. That's absolutely not true. We have pretty good data from multiple nationally representative surveys where we can see switchers. So we see people moving in and out, or adults talking about their educational experiences. In the US, only like 12% of homeschoolers were always homeschooled for their entire homeschool career. So that means that 85, 90% of people who were ever homeschooled also were public schooled, private schooled, other schooled during their academic careers, right? So I'm not sure that for most actual practitioners, there's such a huge identity, right, about themselves as homeschoolers. You know, maybe I'm wrong, but we see a lot of switching in and out. So, you know, and a family may homeschool this child for particular reasons, and publicly school or privately school a different child within that same family. And that could happen for different years, right? Maybe they publicly school them or traditionally school them as elementary students, but then in high school something else happens and they switch, right? So we see a lot of dynamism in schooling choices in U.S. context. And again, these data come from adults. So this is referencing their homeschool experiences from 10 or 15 years ago, right? I would think that it's probably even more dynamic now than you know, maybe the way, right? And so that's one of my questions I've been really thinking about working on is like, what is homeschooling? Are you homeschooled if you only homeschooled 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, or is it 5 or is it 7, or do you have to have homeschooled all years to be a homeschooler? I don't know. So interested to know what people think about that are doing it.
I think you need to be really sensitive, and I think, you know, home educators are not homogenous, and some people, like Angela says, would be fine with that, and some people would definitely not be fine with it. I mean, I did some research myself that was about teachers who home educate, and so, like Angela is saying, you know, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of sharing of perspectives, and I think it's really important, because one of the things that we really need to do, certainly in this country at the moment, is bring people together and find those common spaces and common grounds. Even if we don't always agree with each other, have ways to talk about the things that we disagree with and constructive conversations around it. And that was a great example to the politicians and the policymakers, if we could achieve that. Yeah. But at the same time, I think a lot of sensitivity. I mean, you know, as you can see with the Christian home educators, there were people there who were feeling really threatened, really marginalised, you know, really didn't need to be confronted by anything else. And certainly not, you know, I could see a focus group imploding, you know. And not always because people have said things deliberately, but just because, you know, you say to a parent, how many times do you read to your child? It's a sensitive question. You know, so there's not necessarily any intent behind it, just want some information, but people answering that question, I'm being judged here. So, yeah, be careful.
I think this is an important role that a researcher can play. And if it is possible, I think it is maybe even an obligation to attempt. But I have to say that we have attempted twice and failed. And failed from the side of the system and not the side of the homeschooling community. Not saying that it third time will not be a success, I don't know, but I think if it is possible, then it is our obligation to attempt to facilitate this dialogue, yes.
I have an idea for funding. The climate is heating up at an unprecedented rate, and we're all going to burn up pretty soon. But to me, homeschooling is the most green form of education. You don't have to build buildings, have school buses. The whole entire public system is very bad for the environment. So I'd be interested if any of you could get funding and do research on the impact on global warming that homeschoolers have, and I would believe that we'd be carbon negative, and if we could get some carbon credits, maybe.
That's it, Robert?
That's it.
Okay. It is a good point. It is a good point. Dr. Ray, I thought you were scheduled to be somewhere else. That's why you're not here.
Oh, well, I'm here. Okay, so the several things. We're supposed to see somewhere. I'm in trouble. Oh, thank you. I'm glad that. But anyway, so you mentioned access or cooperation by participants or families, and we hear from the man behind the curtain and his biological buddy there. They're so anxious. They want to be involved, and then we hear from other places. No, they're afraid. They're nervous. Could it be it has something to do with your culture and the already existent laws, the spirit of the place, those kinds of things? I mean, I have an answer, but I want to hear your answers. Why do they want to participate or not, homeschool families?
Yeah, Oz and Ari, honestly, you kind of are the exception from my experience, that you're having so much cooperation from the home education community. And I don't know if you knew that, but if you're able to comment on it.
Just kind of a follow-up comment, just comment on my comment. I think it has something to do with, a worldview that I was talking about this morning. In the United States, most of the homeschoolers for the last 35 years, maybe not so much now, all they wanted to be was left alone. They didn't care. They just want to be left alone. So they don't necessarily need data on them. They don't need you studying. They don't need you analyzing. They don't need you understanding them so much. Their main goal is to be left alone. But you already don't leave them alone, because you have records and numbers and certificates and, maybe where people are born. And, in the United States, if you home birth and you homeschool, the government doesn't need to know by law or anything that you exist. So I think there might be some cultural and national differences. And maybe that'll get your thoughts flowing here.
Yes, I think there are several reasons for the homeschooling community willing to cooperate. Should I speak louder, Brian? Okay. I think the first one has to do with the fact that some of them do wish to be acknowledged and legitimized, but they are not. They are discussed upon not facts, but prejudices and opinions and so on and so on. So for them, once you have real data which you can stand behind, which is a scientific data, then it helps them to be acknowledged and legitimized and so on. And also maybe get fundings from the government or whatever, because in Israel, I know that there are some states in the United States where parents get fundings or all kinds of support. Maybe I'm wrong. I see that.
Some states.
Okay. But in Israel, this is not the case. You get an exemption from mandatory schooling, which means the state does not have any responsibility about it. So I think many homeschoolers wish to be re-acknowledged. So this is one reason. And the second one is, and this is, I don't know why, but I think it is a fact. It relates to what you said. I think there is trust. There is a certain amount of trust between the academics that are researching homeschooling and the homeschooling community, that we are not there to bring harm. Maybe even the opposite way. And since there are not a lot of people homeschooling in Israel and not a lot of people researching, so it is a small community of researchers and a small community of homeschoolers.
I will say, oh, sorry, were you going to? No? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think the legitimization of some of the minority homeschool groups has definitely been important. The Black and Brown community, they've expressed that, particularly the Hispanic Latino community in the U.S. context, that they feel marginalized by society in general, but also marginalized by the homeschool community, and that even a lot of the homeschool support groups, like Facebook groups and those types of things, are predominantly white and kind of white-centered, and they feel kind of othered or not supported in those groups. And, you know, they told me, they were like, you know, and that has been really interesting to me too. We've had a lot of homeschool practitioner people reach out to us, or me in particular. You know, I think they've risked it. I think they were unsure, and, you know, there was, you know, they were going out on a limb there to kind of trust me, but they have come and asked kind of for help. The Hispanic Latino community in particular said, you know, we need data. We need the data showing, because they don't know. We need the data so that people know, and that's what they said. Like the whole theme of their recent conference for Hispanic Latino homeschoolers was we are here. And that's, they want everyone to see that they are part of the homeschool community. I think that that's a huge part of the growth that we've seen in Black and Brown homeschooling in the US since the pandemic, was that there was a huge focus on that community during the pandemic and all of the explosive growth. And then they began to see themselves as belonging in the homeschooling community. Because like I said, you know, the predominant rhetoric was, you know, homeschooling, oh, that's only for middle-class white people, right? That's not what other people do. And so that began to change, I think, during particularly the explosive growth during the pandemic. And so I think that is important. The other thing that's been really kind of shocking since we started the hub, a lot of states have reached out to us for help. So I think that's really an interesting dynamic too, and one that has the potential to be leveraged for good. It's not so much like the state legislators, it's the DOEs, and within those departments of education, they will have sometimes a person that is in charge of like homeschool liaison, right? And they're the ones that field the questions about homeschooling or whatever. We've had people reaching out to us for help. And I know that they're under a lot of pressure because of the growth in homeschooling in their states, and people are pressuring them. What are you doing? What are you gonna do? What's the move here? And they don't know what to do. And so, you know, we've had a lot of people from both sides kind of coming to us and you know, for help. And it is a difficult thing to try to know what to do with some of that information, because you could see how it could go multiple ways. And once the genie's out of the bottle, like you lose control over that. And so it is kind of tricky and you know, something that I'm really cautious about, but it is definitely, these are dynamics that are definitely going on.
I will add to what Ari said, that we invested a lot of efforts creating an atmosphere of trust. We conducted 2 conferences for homeschooling parents. They had like these meetings for adolescents for homeschooling and behavioral problem for homeschooling, and we brought this researcher from the US to speak about homeschooling in the US, and we went and gave like these, I think it was about 15 talks to different groups of homeschooling in Israel, explaining to them, talking with them. We also talked with homeschooling influencers, people that are active and are well known in the homeschooling community. So we actually made a big effort creating an atmosphere of trust Even now, whenever we conduct a study, each family we talk with about the important, why do we need research? And I think the second thing is that it's a Mediterranean culture. Like Italian, like Greeks, I think the problem is getting Israeli to shut up and not to talk.
Let's go with that. Philippe, I'm curious, what is the context in France? You find the homeschool community trusts you, or you've had to establish trust?
In France, there is probably a peculiarity as compared with the US, as far as I know. So I have in mind Mitchell Stevens' Kingdom of Children book, you know, this monograph about the history of home education association in the US, where we can read that. So it's very schematic, but there are two parts of the social movement with the leftists around John Holt at the beginning of the 80s, and the right wing with the HSLDA and so on. So, and in France, at the moment, we do not have such an historical account. So what I will say relies on the way we can tell us the history of the social movement at the moment. But at the moment, we have the feeling that there is no such right-wing part of the movement in France. So the movement is led by the left wing, the unschoolers, and unschoolers, so since the 80s in France, and unschoolers are culturally and socially speaking very near academics. So and they are so the main people, the people we can find as pioneers of the social movement in France, they are journalists who are who sometimes wrote PhD, or who knows, sociologist groups and so on. So the social group is homeschooling pioneers are very close to academics, and that has many effects on the way we can write the story of homeschooling at the moment, because we do not have professional historical accounts. We need someone who will spend some years just trying to find these maybe other homeschoolers that we do not know yet, because they did not want administration nor academics talking about them, but there is at the moment nothing about them. So we need an historical, proactive inquiry. So I just wanted to say that explains the story we can tell at the moment about home education in France, but also the relationships between academics and home educators, because so I really feel at home when I'm with home educators in France, with the social movement advocates. They attend our seminars. We can talk. It's very easy. But of course, I'm talking about the main advocates, the white women who holds master's degree and so on. And we also have some developments in other minoritized population, and they are not yet very commented upon in their academic research. So it's also blind in some ways, but the mainstream advocates are very close to academics, and so they are very, very trustful, very easy trust relationships there.
Thank you. I mean, that's what I find so fascinating about coming to this Global Home Education Conference, is you see the diversity in home education. It's truly a global movement, but how it's expressing itself around the world is culturally very distinct and emerging from different contexts. So it's really fascinating for me, as not an active researcher, but somebody who loves to read what you produce, just what you are uncovering in your scientific project. We have time for a couple more questions? Yes, please.
I think what it is happening, what it is happening here is a great thing. I think that bringing together a homeschooling community and researchers and having these discussions, this one in particular, but other discussions as well, is a great step into producing a good, viable data. And I think putting this in an international concept is even better. So I think what you are doing is great in terms of helping us produce better, more useful data. I think another thing, which maybe I will continue your point from another aspect, I think maybe the community can ask itself what use can they do with the data that we produce, because I think that there are challenges here, and maybe there are even possible harms, but there are also benefits. And I think that if the community would ask itself what kind of benefits can they have from our research, then it would be really a win-win situation. And thank you for putting us all here together. Thank you very much.
I'm very optimistic. I think there's going to be much more research in the next few years. The homeschooling community is growing. It's growing rapidly. So this is a more and more interesting phenomena. I think the number of researchers is growing, and the amount of research conducted is growing. So I think we're going to have excellent data. And I think we need cooperation, international cooperation. We need the French and the Israelis and the US and the England. We need everybody to work together to enable to see differences. And this is fascinating. And this, well, I'm not aware of any study that was intercultural.
Yeah, I fully agree with what have been expressed. So I just maybe will add something a bit aside. Is I don't know if so. My main idea is that you do something very, very important. So securing the research track is very useful for us. No, I just wanted to mention the idea that it could be interesting to circulate the idea that research can be useful when it's not useful. I mean, just accepting to open the field or giving data or giving access to researcher, even if you as advocate or home educators assess that this is a master student who will probably produce some weak research, or you don't know what this researcher has in mind, or he just or she just has a theoretical questions that are very far away from what you need to assert. So it might be a bit difficult to accept, but I would bet that in our situation at the university, we still need to show our colleagues that home education is worth researching, and it will be recognized once we can do something more than just saying, okay, we can tell you what are parental motives, what do youngsters think, etc., because it's a kind of description that's very important. Socially, I think it's more important than many things, but our colleagues who do not care about home education just want to know if we can talk about a cleft habitus of families or some theoretical problems that you were maybe not familiar with and you will never be because it's not interesting. But if we want to promote home education as something that exists in the university, we have to, I would say that it is worth building research about very unuseful questions. And so it may be more difficult to explain to partners what we are researching, because what we will research will not be very useful for them. So we have, and I think it would be useful just because it would foster the idea that home education exists at the university and beyond, because once we will have very good scholarship about home education that is, quote, beyond homeschooling literature, homeschooling studies, because we know ourselves, our publications, but here we need, I would say, to have publications that are quoted by people who are just interested in other things than homeschooling. And I think there are some progress to make here, and it can be more difficult for partners to understand that. So if you can explain that with very theoretical or abstract or uninteresting problems, we need your cooperation too. It might be, in the end, helpful, I would say.
Thank you very much. And Philippe, yes, I agree. I think you want to understand us. The point of the panel is for us to understand you and to hear what your needs and your interests are and your goals are. So to that end, I think you've served us very well this afternoon. I'm so grateful that it has been recorded so we can continue to disseminate it. So thank you so much. Thank you very much for the sacrifice you made to just be here with us this weekend. Thank you, everybody.